Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerome Alford, and I'm the Senior Associate and Managing Partner at DeEtta Jones and Associates. We'd like to thank you and welcome you to the Science of Motivation webinar being hosted by DeEtta Jones and Associates and facilitated by Tyler Dzuba, who is the DJ consultant and facilitator. DeEtta Jones and Associates is a consulting firm, and we've been in existence for 15 years. DeEtta Jones, our founder and principal, started the organization to create a wonderful opportunity to provide consulting and organizational development training, equity, diversity, and inclusion training to companies and organizations around the world. She's been to several places, several libraries, several Fortune 500 companies, as well as several countries talking about organizational development, personal development, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I now officially turn this over to Tyler, who is going to talk about the science of motivation.
Thanks so much, Jerome. Can you hear me okay at this volume?
Yes.
Wonderful. So hi, everyone. Like Jerome said, my name is Tyler Dzuba. I work with DJA as a consultant and facilitator. I've been doing that for the last year or so with DJA. My background is in the library sector, healthcare information, and finance. I'm so excited to be here with you today, sharing a little bit about the science of motivation, how we as individuals become motivated towards goals and visions, and how we can work not only with ourselves, but with the colleagues who we work with, whether that's in the workplace, in community organizations, wherever we find ourselves encountering people, to be able to harness those motivations and move together towards some common goals. Just a couple of things before we get started. So we do have the chat up and running. And please, as I'm going, feel free to type questions in there. Jerome will interrupt me if any urgent questions come in, but we'll also have about half of our time at the end to do some Q&A and talk about anything that piques your interest and you want to know a little bit more about. So we will have until 2 o'clock Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific for this webinar. So we'll spend about half of an hour on the content that I've prepared, and then we'll have about half an hour left to discuss anything that you want to. Before we get started, really in earnest with the content, I want to begin with an exercise that might be familiar to some of you if you've worked with us in our Management Skills Institute. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to reflect back on a couple of memories. One of a time when you were doing your best work and you were really just firing on all cylinders. And another when you weren't doing your best work and weren't able to excel in the ways that you usually do. So we're going to take just a moment for this to set the stage and have a couple of examples in your mind that we can refer back to. You can feel free to, if it helps you for visualizing it, close your eyes, or you can just look at the calm, relaxing background here. Okay. So I'd like you to start by remembering a time when you were doing your best work, when you were really just on your game, doing fantastic things. The kind of work doesn't matter. This could be at your job, doing a hobby, working with friends or family, any context, but a time when you were really in the zone and performing well. How did that experience make you feel? What emotions did it give you? What was that experience like? What circumstances led you to that experience? What got you there? Was anyone else involved? Who were they, and what were their contributions? And then as you reflect on that in your past, how did that carry forward? What effects were there from that experience as you moved into further work in the future? All right. Got a good picture in your head of what that was and what led to it and what the effects were? All right. So now let's change gears a little bit. I want you to think of a different example, a time when you didn't find yourself doing your best work for whatever reason. You just didn't find yourself able to do the kind of fantastic work that you really see yourself doing. And I have really the same questions. How did that experience make you feel? What were the emotions associated with that? Why did it happen? What circumstances led you there? What was affecting the situation? And what were the barriers that might have been preventing you from succeeding? Were there other people involved in the situation? What were their contributions to the situation? And then what did you carry forward from that experience? How did that experience affect you going forward? So now that you have a couple of examples in your head of your best work and a time when you weren't able to do your best work, so hold those in the back of your mind, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about motivation. So in the literature around motivation from social science, psychology, sociology, we talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation, those are the kinds of things that are internal. They're rooted in the direct connection between you and your job. And I'll spend a lot of time and examples in this webinar talking about job and work and career, but this really applies more broadly to any endeavor we find ourselves in. But intrinsic motivation is rooted in that direct connection. What am I doing in this job? How does it affect me? What are my perceptions about it? This is motivation that is applied by yourself to yourself. You can think of things like your interest in the work that you're doing, the challenge that it presents, your commitment to doing good work and producing good results. This kind of motivation tends to inspire and satisfy and create those warm, fuzzy feelings that you were thinking about in relation to your best work. Extrinsic motivation, this is more rooted in the environment and things outside of your direct control. These are often applied by others. Think of things like supervision. You have maybe a manager you're working with and the way that they operate and how that affects your work for better or worse. Policies in your organization, salary, benefits, all these kinds of circumstances and rewards or incentives that create motivation in us one way or another. Now, extrinsic motivation, where intrinsic is more about creating those good feelings that make us keep moving forward, extrinsic is really effective for retaining employees, for example, and preventing dissatisfaction in a workplace. Another way for us to think about this, intrinsic motivation, what we find in the research is that intrinsic motivation is more influential in creating long-term motivation and commitment to common goals. Extrinsic motivation has its place as well, but it has a different focus. Extrinsic motivation is much more influential on the short term, on correcting a problem, on complying to policy, on getting us to do things right away. Both of these have their place. If there's a fire in the building that you're in, the very last thing you want to do is sit down and say, all right, we need to make a committee to decide how we're going to deal with the fire. Okay, so could you take minutes? Great. Let's decide how we're going to deal with this fire situation we're encountering. No, you need to do something right away. Extrinsic motivation is great for that. There is a fire, we need to get out of the building, go, go, go. Intrinsic motivation is a lot more appropriate for situations where we're thinking about the long term. We're thinking about creating a vision together. These are the sorts of things you're going to want to create a committee, have a process, decide together and explore how all of your ideas weave together into something common. And we can produce better results by leveraging intrinsic motivation as opposed to only extrinsic motivation. And we'll talk a little bit later on about some of the different ways we can apply these and how these two interleave. So in our workshops, we find ourselves referring to a large amount of research from the 50s, 60s, 70s that was really the core of management theory and organizational theory. One of the sort of founding people of that field, Frederick Hertzberg, said, if you want people to do a good job, give them a good job to do. Hertzberg and his work was also contemporaneous with a couple of other professors, Greg Oldham and Richard Hackman. Oldham was a management professor, is a management professor, and Hackman is a social psychologist. And their work, which was sort of contemporaneous with Hertzberg, is in job characteristic theory at this time in the 70s. So what Oldham and Hackman were working on was, what are really the core pieces of what makes a job good? What makes it something that somebody wants to do? On the left here, you see these 5 items: task variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback. And these are the core job dimensions that Hackman and Oldham identified as things that are influential in creating these things on the right, which are these critical psychological states of finding meaning in your work, feeling that you have responsibility and the ability to create a good outcome, as well as having knowledge of the results of your work and what the outcomes of that work are. So these 5 core job dimensions you see on the left. In Hackman and Oldham's research, they found produce these psychological states on the right, which support all sorts of fantastic outcomes. In a lot of ways, this is the core of what motivation is, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic. Motivation supports outcomes. And being aware of these core dimensions, which are things that either for yourself or say as a manager or in working with a team, you can think of task variety, identity, significance, autonomy, and feedback as things that you can influence to make your work more motivating for yourself, as well as to make the work of everyone around you who you work with more motivating and more exciting. Okay, so that's some of the background. Let's talk about specifics a little bit. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about one possible approach and some things we can think about in motivating ourselves. In a little bit, we'll talk about motivating colleagues and trying to produce an environment that people find motivating that drives them forward. So in motivating ourselves, here are these 4 steps. In this one approach, not the only way, but some things I want to focus on today. First, we start with values, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Identifying vision. What is it that I, for myself, want to produce? Where do I want to go? Then we try to chart a map. What does it take to get us there? And also, throughout this process, it's important to reflect on not only the progress that we're making as we go, but where we've been. Okay, some of you in the room have probably seen this before. This figures in our Management Skills Institute 2 on the organization. And I'll walk us quickly through this creative tension model. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A if we want to, but I just want to give us this baseline for those who might not have seen it before. So the creative tension model comes out of the work of Peter Senge, who was a management researcher. The main focus of his work was the learning organization. which is a whole theory about how organizations can work to not only do continuous rote tasks, but to grow and learn and develop together and understand the systems that drive and affect the work that they do. So organizational learning theory is a huge focus for us at DJA. This creative tension model points us to the difference between how we interact with a vision versus how we interact with fear. So in the middle of this diagram, you see current reality. This is where we are now, where I am now, where my organization is now. And these are the objective facts, not necessarily any meaning that we're applying to them, but just the facts about where we are. On the right side, you see vision. Now, vision is the compelling future state that we're trying to build together. And this is based on our shared values as an organization. On the right side, in the absence of a clear, compelling vision, the human brain automatically turns to fear. Our fears of what might go wrong or what we might need to be running from as an organization, the problems that we're trying to fix. When we have that vision, we're able to develop this state of creative tension that drives us forward. But in the absence of that vision, we revert to emotional tension. And so we often use the words distress for that emotional tension and eustress, E-U-R-S-T-R-E-S-S, as you see on the screen. Eustress is that driving force when we see a vision that we're excited about, that we want to make happen, not just myself, but as an organization. That's what drives us forward. So I'm giving you this just as a quick model to keep in the back of your head as we go forward. This model is centered in the work of organizations, but it also applies to the individual, right? If I have this compelling vision that I'm working towards, that's where I'm going to derive my motivation from. That's where that creative tension comes in. In the context of an organization, we all might have slightly different views of that vision, slightly different things that are motivating us forward. But if we have a center vision to draw upon together, then we're able to weave together our diverse goals and exact ways that we see the future to produce something fantastic together. So I want to focus us on the right side of this. We'll be spending a little bit of time here for the next 10 minutes talking about the individual and about organizations. So we talked about current reality on the left, vision on the right. Another way we can think about motivation is as that creative tension. What's driving us forward? So on the left, you see those 4 steps that I laid out, thinking about individual motivation for ourselves. We always start with values. When I asked you earlier to think about what was a situation when you were able to do your best work, I asked you to think about what were the circumstances that led to that and what was making it good, essentially. That's one way for us to think about our values. What is it in a work situation, in a hobby, in a collaboration that really drives us forward and makes us excited about moving forward in that process? If we're able to start with those values, we can then identify a little bit more of a cohesive vision of where we want to go, which isn't necessarily about the specific outcomes. It can be, but think again about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, right? Intrinsic motivation is often focused on those intangible things. I felt good about this project because I felt that I was making a difference in the world, or I felt that I was able to do it on my own, and that autonomy is really important to me. Those are the kinds of things we can identify as things that motivate us forward and things that are elements of that vision we're creating for ourselves. Then we chart a map. I'll get to that in the next slide. What is this roadmap? How do we really systematize how we want to get to that vision? and then reflecting on progress. So as far as charting a map, this is a tool that I've found useful for myself and for working with others as well. And this, I've seen it come up in a lot of different venues. I originally saw it at the University of Rochester when I was working at the libraries there. Our dean, Marianne Mavernack, had published on this as the leadership focuser or the lifetime focuser. But it's come up in a lot of different venues. The idea here is, once you've identified those values and you've thought about that vision, where do I want to go someday? That someday could be in a year, could be 5 years, could be, the rest of your life. I want to retire well. Those sorts of visions. We put that someday goal in the upper left. Then we start working backwards. If I want to retire well, and that's my goal, I put that in my someday box. What needs to happen in the next 10 years to move me in that direction? And if I'm going to complete that thing in 10 years, what needs to happen in 5 years to move me in that direction? And we scale that back to 1 year, 3 months, 1 month, 1 week. And what can I do tomorrow to set me up for that thing that I want to have completed within the next week? So if I want to retire well, maybe in 1 week, I want to have an appointment with my 401k manager. And tomorrow I can call them to set that appointment. Getting down to really concrete steps. Now, this is in some ways challenging because we need to start with that vision, and getting down to those concrete steps can be difficult. But remember, the goal here is not to set your to-do list for the next 50 years. Your goal is to set your to-do list for tomorrow. That signpost, that vision, and the steps that you've charted along the way may change over time. Maybe next week I meet with my 401k manager and they say, you're okay, there's not really anything to do right now. Don't need to do anything in the next month. Great, fabulous. I get to think a different way about what does it mean for me to retire well? And those signposts may change. This is simply a tool for us to think about those grand overarching visions in a way that's approachable and that we can actually take action on. The other power in this, which we're not going to go into a lot of detail on, don't have a lot of time, but we can also think backwards. Where am I now? And how did I get there? What did I do a month ago, a year ago, 5 years ago that set me up well? And what successes have I had over time? One of the biggest challenges in motivation is seeing the influence of the work that you're doing today. And it can be so valuable to look back a year, 3 years, 5 years, see where you were, and look more at what have you accomplished in that time? How can you celebrate those things? And how can you carry that momentum forward? This we talk about in our Management Skills Institute as the gap. And we can talk about that a bit more in the Q&A if we want to. So let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about ourselves. Now, what about working with colleagues and motivating our colleagues around us? Again, one approach. Similar sorts of steps, identifying shared values. We're going to consider those core job dimensions that we talked about. Identifying and addressing barriers. Considering diversity. Our colleagues are not all the same, and the same things will not motivate all of them. And then making a plan together. A couple of other factors I wanted to put in here from the research. So this first point comes from Desi, Kestner, and Ryan. In thinking about the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, sometimes extrinsic motivators can diminish the effect of intrinsic motivators. Even if we find ourselves in a situation where we are intrinsically motivated towards a vision, towards a goal, one of our Well, one of the strategies that people often turn to in the workplace are external motivators. Can we increase salary? Can we increase benefits? Can we give people better feedback? What the research shows is that demotivating barriers to successful work are often extrinsic. Think back to the beginning. We were talking about your not best work, when you were encountering barriers that kept you from being as successful as you wanted to be. And I asked you what contributed to that. What we find in our workshops and what the research supports is that in most cases, not all cases, but most cases, the things that we find contributing to those situations, those barriers, are extrinsic motivators gone wrong. Maybe it's challenges with management or restrictive policies, or I had this very difficult committee that I was working with and we just couldn't see eye to eye. Things that are outside of my intrinsic motivation. So we have to think about, in working with our colleagues, how the extrinsic motivators that we exert power over, that we have control over, for our colleagues, their extrinsic motivators. If we're not careful, we can create demotivating barriers with those things. Another interesting thing I came across in the literature. So Yoon, Sung, and Choi, this was a collaboration between Cornell and a couple of Korean universities. They found, in looking at creativity in organizations, that intrinsic motivators are essential. Now that sounds obvious on the face of it, right? But what they were looking at was, in creative roles, which more and more of us find ourselves in. Very few of us on this call, I bet, are producing widgets day after day. We're not on factory lines, most of us. We're working in roles where we have to be creative, either in producing creative work or creatively working with colleagues to solve problems, knowledge work. What they found was both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation have a role in supporting creativity. But extrinsic motivation had only an indirect role in supporting creativity, whereas intrinsic motivation had a very direct role on whether people felt motivated towards their creative work. And if that intrinsic motivation was missing, if people didn't have intrinsic motivation towards the creative work they were doing, extrinsic motivators didn't matter at all. And in fact, might hurt based on the research we looked at above from Desi, Kestner, and Ryan. So things to think about, that intrinsic motivation is very important for us to support in our colleagues. We can't necessarily have a direct impact on that. I can't just say to you, hey, DeEtta, I need you to be excited about this work because it'll be good for you, gosh darn it. That doesn't really work that way. But we can try to create an environment where our colleagues are best able to harness the intrinsic motivation that they find themselves. So I've got those same 5 bullet points in the lower left. I've got our vision, motivation, and this path, this roadmap, as well as these core job dimensions: task variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback, that lead to these critical psychological states. So just a couple of things on the screen for us to point to. Identifying shared values. We talked a little bit about how vision comes from values. And one thing that we really focus on at DJA, whenever we're doing strategic planning with an organization or in our management skills institutes, we really focus on how personal vision allows us to distill personal values, which we did to some extent earlier today. But once we have a group of people identifying their personal values, we can take that a step further. What are our shared values as the group? What kind of organization do we want to be? How do we want to be together? And then once we have those shared values identified, we can figure out a shared vision. What are we all aiming for? that exhibits those values, that expresses those values in real life. So identifying shared values is an important step here. If I'm working with an individual and trying to figure out how can I help you be more motivated in your work in our organization, first thing I have to think about is, what are we trying to do together? What values do we share? Jerome, we have a question from the audience.
Yes. Can you say something about what task identity is?
Yes. So there are a couple of elements here. Let me dig a little bit more into these core job dimensions. So task variety, pretty obvious. People tend to derive meaning and motivation in their work from having different types of work that they do throughout the day. If I'm just at a factory line making a widget constantly, if I'm just proofreading documents, then I don't have a lot of variety. But if I have a variety of work I can do, that's great. Significance, also pretty obvious. This is, does my work matter for the organization? Task identity, in my understanding, is, and actually, before I say this, I am gonna look this up really quick because I don't want to misspeak. Yes. Okay. So in Oldham and Hackman's construction of the job characteristics theory that they worked on with these core job characteristics and critical psychological states, they defined task identity as the degree to which we are able to identify with the outcome of the work. Not just, I create a widget, I pass it down the line, I never see it again. But I'm able to see the whole thing start to finish, and I'm able to see how the task and work fits into the larger picture. I'm able to identify not just what the task is, but why it matters. And it's sort of related to the significance in that way. Significance is more about the end product and then what happens to that product afterwards. Why does it matter in the wider world? But for task identity, it's about seeing within the process that we have as an organization, how does this task fit into it? And can I see myself and my work having an impact on the people around me? So it is similar to task significance in that way. But if we think about a process as an organization, let's say I'm working on a committee, task identity is, does the thing I'm doing right now have an influence on the committee's work and on the outcomes that we were charged with producing? Task significance is about after we've completed our work, and that work is having its effect in our organization or in our broader community. Did that work matter in the end? AJ, I hope that that addresses a little bit of the difference between those two things. Happy to talk about it a little bit more as we proceed. So thank you for that question. Oh, come back. Okay. So we talked about identifying shared values and how that allows us to develop a common vision. Then we have to consider those core job dimensions as we were just talking about. If I'm working with either people I'm supervising or people who I work with in a more lateral way, I have to consider, what do these core job dimensions have to do with the work that they're doing and where they might be demotivated? Do they not see how their work fits into the team? Do they not see the broader impact of their work? Do they have enough autonomy? Are they able to make choices about the work that they do? We can't necessarily, allow everyone to have free reign deciding power over everything, but can we create elements of that? Are there things that we can allow our colleagues to decide without our influence that they then bring back to us and we discuss and we're able to celebrate? Can we provide better feedback? Feedback we could talk about a little bit more as we go. But feedback is critical in any successful organization where I get to know the impact of my work and I get to hear from the people who I work with what worked about it, what didn't work, what could I do better. All of these things are important, especially the positive feedback aspect of that. So we have to think about those core job dimensions. Identifying and addressing barriers. So this is about, as we start to develop a vision together, and we start to think about what could we do to make this work even more motivating for people. We also need to think about what's in the way. Is there policy that is challenging this? Is it that this person doesn't have the knowledge or resources to be able to do this as successful as they'd like? Is there more training that needs to be created? So we can think about addressing these barriers. I also bring up considering diversity as a part of this, especially when we find ourselves working with wider groups of colleagues. Not everyone operates the same way. Not everyone comes from the same background. Not everyone is motivated by the same sorts of things. This is something that is challenging work, but essential. Because if we're trying to create a one-size-fits-all approach to motivation, we will not be successful. We might be successful with one, because one size fits one. But when it comes to motivation, we need customized solutions, and that requires really having the cultural competence to understand more about ourselves and what perspective we're coming from, and how that perspective might differ from those around us, and having the ability to listen to what we're hearing and to see what people are telling us about what motivates them. And then making a plan, same as we talked about before. We need to be able to gather all those things that we've thought about, and in conversation with our colleagues. This isn't happening in a vacuum. I can sit back and say, well, I think Jerome would be motivated by this or that, and I think he might be a little bit frustrated with the autonomy that he has around this project. And it's good for me to do that pre-work for myself, to think through these things. But then I need to have that conversation with him. I need to have that conversation with the team that I'm trying to develop this motivation alongside, to think about what's working, what's not working, what could we build together, thinking about these core job dimensions, thinking about our shared values and vision, and using those things as a reference point, as a prompt for our further conversation and further digging into how we create ways to motivate not just me, not just you, but the entire team of colleagues that we're working with towards something together. So we're at about 1:40 Eastern. I want to leave you with a couple of takeaways, a couple of things that you can do. So first, for yourself, I'd like you to spend some time considering the alignment of your values, your vision, your personal vision, and your intrinsic motivators. What are the things that really capture you and excite you and keep you moving forward? I want you to also reflect on where you've been. What progress have you made towards your goals in the last year, the last 3 years, the last 5 years, whatever's meaningful for the kind of dimension that you're looking at, the kind of goals and vision. And then try to identify some specific goals from tomorrow through whenever makes sense that move you in that direction. And remember, those aren't set in stone. They're signposts. They're guides to keep moving you forwards and making a plan. For your colleagues, I'd like you to identify at least one person in your circles of influence who you can support or who you're currently working with, and who you want to think about, how can I support their motivation? How can I create an environment that's productive for them? Consider their situation yourself. Who are they? What values do you share? What do you know motivates them based on what you've seen? Consider those 5 core dimensions. How can you support this person through those 5 dimensions? And what barriers might exist that keep them from realizing and developing the internal motivation to succeed? And then the step that I didn't write on here is have the conversation with them. Once you've done that pre-work yourself, sit down with them and, you're working on this project. Hey, let's take a moment to step back. What are you thinking about this project? What's motivating or demotivating about it? And how can we make those things better together? And you'll have that frame in the back of your mind to be able to guide that conversation successfully. And this is not a one-time and done process. Both of these need to be repeated over time because our circumstances change, our vision changes over time, and our motivation towards that vision will need to adjust accordingly. Okay, a couple of housekeeping things, and then we've got about 15-20 minutes for Q&A. So you will be receiving a copy of this presentation, a recording. I should be able to share the slides as well. And then just a handout, a brief summary of a little bit of the content and those exercises that we just went over. Jerome, any other housekeeping things before we open up for Q&A?
No, Tyler, thank you. Awesome presentation.
Thank you. So does anyone have questions or things that they want to dig in with a little bit further? Please enter those in the chat, and we'll take until 2 Eastern to discuss those if we have any thoughts or questions. All right, I see a question from Sarah asking about the creative tension model. So let me go back there, and please feel free to continue adding your questions. Okay, and Catherine, I see your question as well, and we will definitely have time for that. Okay, so back to the creative tension model. So like I said earlier, this comes from the work of Peter Senge and his work with the learning organization and organizational learning theory. So the core idea with the creative tension model is when we are all as individuals in an organization moving in different directions, we have different goals, different priorities, and we all see our small piece of the wider picture. How do we collectively create the creative tension, this driving force, to actually get anything productive done? And not just anything productive, but something that reflects our shared values together. So what this model lets us look at is first, what drives us towards a vision? And then also what we so often revert to, which is fear. So on the right side, when we've identified something compelling that we're working towards together, this vision, a compelling compelling future state. We were able to harness that excitement for that vision as a group. The important thing in a vision is not that it is achievable. It's not something that we're going to check off a box. Oh, we've done our vision. We're done. Pack it up, guys. We've made it. Not going to happen that way. The vision, the point of that is to give us something to shoot towards. And in sort of this modified version that I provided on the next slide, this roadmap, and I think, Elizabeth, I'm not sure. I see your question asking about the goals map. Oh, I know what you're talking about. Okay, you're talking about, yes. We will get to that. So we can create distinct goals along the way that guide us towards that vision. And those are the things that we need to make sure that we have metrics for, that we're achieving over time. The vision is something that we've developed, not just me at the top of the org chart or a committee of our peers, but all of us together to find something that really reflects the values that we share as an organization. And that's what drives us forward. And that's what develops that creative tension. In the absence of having a vision that we're moving towards together, something that we've talked about and that we've developed corporately, we revert towards fear. What could go wrong? What about my piece? What if, well, the organization's decided we're moving in that direction, but I don't understand how my work or how I fit into that. And we end up in this spiral of distress. The important thing to take away from the creative tension model is that we all collectively as an organization have the ability to develop our vision together and to think about who do we want to be and how do we want to act. So that's the brief summary of what's going on with creative tension. Sarah, I hope that addresses your question. Thank you.
There's several more in the chat box.
Yes. So which one should we proceed with, Jerome?
Go ahead with Catherine's question.
Okay. So Catherine, you asked, would you add anything different if your colleagues are volunteers? That is a fantastic question. I think the important thing to note here is as we think about our intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, extrinsic motivators are, I would argue, far less powerful with volunteers in that people are deciding they want to be here. And I'll come back to that because that's important. But you can't just say, if you do this fantastic job, then you might have this promotion coming down the road or that sort of thing. You can't create that sort of extrinsic motivation. You can create other forms of extrinsic motivation. Thinking of feedback in particular, can you be communicating with the people who are volunteering in your organization to say, this is working fantastically. I'm so glad that you came up with this idea and that you devoted your time to it. But the big benefit that you have working with volunteers is that they have chosen to be there for the most part. You've always got somebody who was voluntold, but with your volunteers, they already have that intrinsic motivation going for them in the most case. People do not show up on Saturday morning with no pay because somebody made them most of the time. Most of the time, they have at least some sense of, I want to do this because it's valuable. So it does give you a leg up in working with volunteers. So if you wanted to think of it as like a carrot and stick model, there's not much of a stick. The volunteering relationship's not working out. People will leave, or if you say, I don't know that we can really do that project again, people will probably be okay and they'll go off and do their own thing and that's fine. but you have that benefit of people already being intrinsically motivated to be there. The other thing that's worth noting about this, and why it might be a little bit different for volunteers, is I'm trying to think of how to say this. The connection is much looser and different from how you would work with someone who's an employee, who has, at the very minimum, they're excited to be getting that paycheck and they need that paycheck. So it is a different dynamic, but I think a lot of the same things apply. You may have a clearer base to start from as far as shared values and why we're all here that we can focus around. All right. So I see another question from Leanna. I've had a challenge of some people not wanting the responsibility, but wanting the autonomy. Any suggestions on how to work through this? This is very interesting. I have a couple of thoughts, but if those of you who are listening have some thoughts as well, please feel free to add those to the chat. This does not just need to be me spouting my ideas. So please feel free to add things. But Leanna, what comes to mind for me, I think this is where it'd be very important to think about goals and what is the roadmap getting us from point A to point B? Because that can, especially for those people, like, because I know exactly the kind of people you're talking about. They want to decide how we're going to do it, but don't necessarily want the responsibility of either A, getting it done, or B, responding to feedback. Those are the kinds of people who I'm thinking about. And those are challenging situations. But when we start to think about, if we start with values and vision, and we're able to agree on those things, then identifying the steps that we use along the way to accomplish goals, some of the responsibility might come out of that, of, all right, well, we've decided we want to do this, and you've made this fantastic suggestion about how we could do it. What does that mean for us down the road? And what steps do we need to prepare for now that we'll need to complete later? And what's your part in that, and what's my part in that? So there may be some opportunities there. The other place that these kind of conversations break down sometimes are around those shared values and vision. We so often think, especially in like the nonprofit world or higher ed, we all on some level share a number of values. And we make the assumption that because we share some values, we share all values. And that's rarely true. And so often we jump past that step in the process as well and don't think about, well, we're all talking about heading sort of the same direction, but what does that really mean? And how do we want to act with each other? And what kinds of things do we want to create together? So sometimes having a more detailed conversation, really an intentional conversation about values and vision, can also clarify those sorts of things where it's not just that you are responsible for making things successful, but we are all responsible together. So those are the two places I would probably focus. Do we actually share the same values? And can we look at the individual steps that we're using, the goals that we're setting along the way to get there, and how all of us may have a part to play in creating success together? I hope that's helpful to some extent. So Elizabeth, you were asking about the goals map. So I think you were talking about this slide. Thank you. I laid out in a slightly weird way. Jerome, can you see my mouse on the screen as I'm moving it?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good, because I've been motioning with it for the last 15 minutes. So I'm glad people are seeing it. So the way to think about this, these are all the same sequence, but top to bottom, left to right. So someday, 5 years, 3 years, 1 year, 3 months, 1 month, 1 week, tomorrow. just using a little bit more of the vertical space, but these really are linear. Though I think, it can also be productive to think of this as detailed actions related to the one above. That could also be a use to use it in thinking, but really that's the purpose of the exercise overall, to take your general goal that you want to accomplish eventually and to scale that down step by step to think about what could I do in a shorter period of time to be successful. Glad that helped. All right.
I think Latanya's question is next.
Yes. Tyler, have there been roadblocks to overcome in doing these motivation exercises? And how do you approach any difficulties? I'd also be interested to hear other people's challenges. For me, yes, definitely. There are always roadblocks. And I think it's a little bit different for everybody in applying these kinds of exercises. For me, I'm the kind of person who is always running in several different directions at once. So when people come to me and say, define your personal vision, my response is, okay, which one do you want? Is it Tuesday or Thursday? What's happening? And what am I focusing on? All of these exercises that we're talking about have to be limited in scope in some way. Nobody has one unified personal vision that they can express in a sentence. But I might have a vision for my job, or I might have a vision for presenting this webinar. And so I can think about all of these things in as small or large a context as is useful. In the context of an organization of 300 people who's developing a strategic plan, that's got to be a pretty broad, comprehensive vision. And it has to cover all of the aspects of what strategy they want to develop together. But for a department of 10, it's probably a little bit smaller, and it's something that they will approach in very different ways from how their department of 10 fits into the organization of 300. So that's the first thing. The challenge so to encapsulate that a little bit better, often people try to make these conversations too broad. It can often be helpful to decide, okay, what context are we talking about right now? Are we talking about the working group and trying to get its deliverables done? Are we talking about buying a house in the next year? Are we talking about developing a webinar that I'm presenting next week? So having that scope discussion can be very important. The other thing that can be difficult is with the colleagues portion that I was talking about. Very, very important to recognize that you as somebody's colleague are not having that conversation in a vacuum with yourself. And I have been in conversations where people have said, well, I've been thinking about your situation and I think this would be really good for you. It may not be wrong, but we haven't had the full conversation yet. We haven't thought about the full scope of that individual or that group and what might be motivating or demotivating them more broadly. These are very rarely quick conversations. I've given you a couple of exercises here as starting places, but the more important thing is that these are practices that we are developing over time, that we're practicing, that we're trying out and we're refining and we're making mistakes with and we're getting better at. So yeah, motivation is never one and done, and there's always more going on than we know about. There's, especially when we're talking about large groups or even small groups of colleagues, everyone has their own different individual motivations and situations that they're dealing with. So those are the two the two challenges that I've encountered that come to mind right now and in time. So I see that we are at 2 o'clock Eastern. So thank you all so much for your time and for your really thoughtful questions. It's been really a joy to talk with you today. You'll be receiving an email with or a link to the recording of the webinar, as well as a handout summarizing some of this and the couple of exercises to take forward. And Jerome has also added in the chats, if you have any additional questions or comments, you can email us at contact@DeEttaJones.com. Jerome, any closing thoughts?
Just want to say thank you again to everyone. Again, you can contact us for feedback, questions, or further dialogue on the topic at contact@DeEttaJones.com. And we appreciate you for being a part of today's session. And kudos, Tyler. Thank you for facilitating a great conversation for us. Have a great day, everyone.